Uh, Salam, everyone. I think we are now moving to the final stage of the impact assessment, which is impact mitigation. And this is a very short unit because there is no actual assessment involved. It is about suggesting what are all the mitigation measures the project proponent is going to uh, promise in the EIA document for all the significant impact he identified in his project. So, as we have gone through the main stages, which is screening, scoping, impact analysis, and finally we are here, which is basically impact mitigation. So it's very simple. It's a logical sequence. All the significant impacts identified from scoping and which has been analyzed and predicted in impact analysis. Now we have a list of potential adverse impacts from the project. Now you are going to, as a project owner, to tell the government how he or she is going to mitigate that impact. That is the final stage of EIA. So once this is done, the EIA is completely over. So then it is just reporting, and the rest of the thing goes to the regulator and policy maker for decision making for approval of the proposal. So what is this mitigation? Mitigation by definition is a measure envisaged in order to avoid, reduce, and if possible, remedy the significant adverse effects of development activities. In our case, any project in which you have did the EIA. So the keywords is avoid, reduce, and remedy. So these are your measures may fall into any one of these categories, which we are going to see in a minute. So to give a general scheme of mitigation, which is called as elements of mitigation, the first most favorable, common, which is preferable option of mitigation as element of mitigation is avoidance. So if you remember, we in one of the units study about alternatives, project alternatives. So avoidance, normally this kind of mitigation comes at the early stage of the project planning. Alternative sites, or finding, for example, landfill, a best site which is environmentally better. That is an example of avoidance. Avoiding environmentally sensitive areas for the project sites. These are the avoidance mechanisms. Just by avoiding that, you will be tremendously decreasing the environmental adverse impacts of the projects, and including change of technologies. If you remember, I mentioned that in paper industries, which process you are going to choose for your project. That is an example of avoidance. This is basically something which, as I said, happens in the designing of the project. So not most of the time it is not, you don't see them commonly in a EIA proposal or an EIA submitted for the government. So most of the mitigation measures you find in the EIA document falls into the element of minimization. So what is minimization is what are all the measures the project owner is going to take during the construction, operation, and decommissioning phases of the project for those impact which you identified in your scoping, and you develop the impact analysis through the assessment stage. So this is what normally you find. Minimization is the predominant mitigation measures which has been found in the original EIA documents. Now, after minimization measures are done, still there are impacts that can be felt on the project surrounding areas. So still again, the project owner is responsible for that impact. So then comes the last one is the compensation. So after putting so much of measures in minimizing your impact, still there are residual impacts on the environment that the owner is responsible, and he or she should compensate, which is basically as the last resort. So I will come back to that. This says it is undesirable. Why? I'll talk about the idea and ideology behind that particular thing. So the most favorable is avoidance, preferable, and most practical thing you find in the document appraisal is minimization, and you can also rarely found compensation depending on the project. For example, one good example of compensation is, for example, in the dam project, there is a displacement of people. So you cannot avoid that because you are going to construct the dam. You cannot minimize the impact on human habitation which are already living inside the project site. So you cannot also minimize. So the only option available is compensation. So though it is undesirable because you are not left with any option, you have to provide them alternative land for their living. So that is an example of compensation. But when it comes to the real, what you find in the EIA document, as I said, is the minimization. So to put it in the basic categories, there are 4 major categories. First one, as we have discussed, is avoiding. So you have to find a mechanism to avoid the whole problem itself that is good for the project. Okay? So this is also a very difficult case, because now if you have no alternative site, you have to work with only one site for your project development. Then if that is a environmentally sensitive site, you cannot avoid the problem. Okay? So this is most of the time practically very, very difficult, except for a few types of projects. So avoiding is avoiding the impact altogether by what you called as either taking an action or a part of action. So change of route, alternative site. This is an action. Part of action, for example, change the technology or change the chemicals which are involved in the processing. From a toxic chemical, instead of using toxic chemical, highly toxic chemical, using a chemical which are very less toxic, which is basically kind of a part of an action, right? So that's an example of avoiding. So if if you cannot avoid, then it goes to the next rung called reducing. This is what is the major mitigation measure you find in the EIA document. So if, for example, if pollution is the major problem from the project, reducing involves predominantly minimizing the degree, the magnitude, the duration, and the extent of the adverse impact. If it is a pollution, then introducing pollution control mechanism, waste treatment, and these are all an example of reducing categories. Then after you reduce the impact in different stages of the project, there are going to be still some residual impacts after you release your emissions or wastewater into the environment. For example, if it is a water pollution or an air pollution, then still the project owner is responsible, in the sense that the receiving environment should be what you called as going to the third approach, which is the third category, which is rectifying. You have to rectify that damage caused to the surrounding environment. So rectifying the impact includes repairing the problem, rehabilitating, or restoring the affected environment. These are all the examples of what you call as rectifying, or you call as remedy. So now, so this all your the physical or structural measures are over here. Now, what is that small thing which is hanging here down is, if after rectifying, after reducing, then rectifying, still these impacts are there in the environment or your receiving environment, where people are using this for a longer period of time, now they are not able to use. So there is a loss of resource. So if people are not able to anymore use this resource because of the project impact, people may lose the job, their occupation, or it can be any activity they are doing around the project. Then the project owner resort to the other category, which is called compensation. So he has to compensate these people who are affected by the project. Okay? So now what I'm going to do in the next slide is to take one example from our prediction and assessment unit, which has been done for a resort. Let us assume that this resort is going to come up in a coastal area or in a marine environment. So now, after identifying the impact, these are all the significant impact we have identified. Now, let us take water pollution, and the project proponent has to put what he is going to do to reduce the impact of water pollution at the construction phase, what are all the measures he is going to take at the operation phase and also at the decommissioning phase. So look, the problems of water pollution in construction phase and operation phase are different. For a resort, if you construct a resort, most of the time this water pollution comes from clearance of the ground, so on and so forth, that the water pollution contains only sediments, so on and so forth. So it requires certain type of mitigation measures. But in comes to operation phase, in hotels and resorts, what is the major thing which causes water pollution is wastewater. And that wastewater contains different kind of parameters, what we saw in our impact prediction and assessment. I mean, in terms of different parameters, high BOD, it has oil and grease, and of course it is a resort. They will be using a lot of detergents, soaps, sanitation things, so on and so forth. This may be contributing to the water pollution, and so here the mitigation measures are going to be very different depending on the nature of your water pollution. So I will give you a very simple example so that it will sit in your mind how these three approaches can be paralleled or equated to understand these three major approaches, including the compensation. Right. So as I said, can you guess what is this? Definitely, this is not chocolate. This is the soaps which are used in resorts, in hotels, so on and so forth. Now, if water pollution is identified as a significant impact from this resort project, and mostly this is coming into the operation phase. So because once they started using detergent, soap, so on and so forth. Now, these soaps are, let us say, are conventional soaps made up of chemicals, and these chemicals, once they enter into the wastewater coming from the hotel, they are going to be discharged into the receiving environment, and that is going to create a serious adverse impact through the water pollution. So what is the mitigation measure? The first, if you take the first mitigation measure, is avoiding. How to avoid? In the case of, as I said, these are chemical based soap. Now in your mitigation plan, you are saying that this hotel is not going to use any chemical based plants and it is going to use eco based soaps, which have either less or absolutely no substance, especially phosphate, which is responsible for eutrophication in the receiving environment. And when you put this mitigation measure, this comes into the category called avoiding the problem. So all the phosphate which are contributing to your water pollution, is going to be completely coming down in terms of adverse impacts, because phosphorus is totally eliminated because for the use of the phosphate based non-phosphate based eco based soaps. So this is a good example of avoidance. So then now the situation now, for example, if this project owner cannot offer to have using this as a mitigation measure, either because it's very costly or it's not available, whatever it is. Now this particular avoidance is out of the choice. Now what now you will be having, you will start moving to the looking for the reducing approach. So now you are going to use a chemical based substance and your mitigation measure is to reduce. How are you going to reduce the adverse impact? Okay, the one form of a minor form of reduction is using less of these things. For example, there are different sizes of soaps here, right? So what is reducing? Reducing less use of these conventional soaps. I mean, using, for example, a small soap. A small size soap is one form of reducing the impact, but they are absolutely minor in terms of impact reduction is concerned. The actual reduction is that these chemicals are going to come up with your wastewater. Then now what are you going to do to reduce? In fact, to reduce the thing is by suggesting or telling the government that you are going to reduce these chemicals from the wastewater by putting a physical structure to reduce the phosphate, especially in the term of effluent treatment plant. So this is a good example of reduction, right? So this is one of the actual reducing approach for a particular problem coming from water pollution from the resort. Now you tried avoidance, you have taken reducing measures, then you are going to release these treated wastewater into the receiving environment around the project site. It can be a river or a marine system, whatever it is. Now, is the mitigation measure over? No. So after you release, these chemicals may still able to create certain impact around the surrounding project or the receiving environment. Like for example, as I said, that these phosphates which are contained in the soap will induce eutrophication in the receiving environment, right? So basically what happens here is this impact which you are causing through your project may affect the people who are using these resources. Say, for example, they may be using that for recreational purposes like swimming or some fishing activities are going on. So your project will affect that. So the project owner have to move on to the next category in terms of reducing the impact by rectifying this problem or remedy. You have to by using restoration processes or repairing, so that you will at least repair these damage caused by eutrophication from your project so that people can continuously use these resources. So this belongs to the third category of rectifying. Now, all your physical structural approaches are exhausted now. Now, you will be asking a question now, okay, after rectifying, if there is no further improvements in the receiving environment, is still the project owner responsible? The answer is yes. So if after you are rectifying, you try to restore, rehabilitate, and now people come to realize, the communities around that, they are not able to use these particular resources, say for example swimming, then you have to provide the compensation, an alternative site. Okay, so you have to create an alternative site so that people can use that resources. So this is one for us recreational purposes. If some fishing activities are going on here and there is no more fishing, so people are affected, the community is affected, then you have to give compensation in terms of money to the affected people. So that is another form of compensation. Okay, so this is a very good example how avoiding, reducing, rectifying, and compensation can be applied in a mitigation process. So as it's clearly mentioned, the most used mitigation measure, as I said, in the project proposals, are predominantly reducing, right? So you will find 90% are towards reducing. Now, this is a very good one example. Now you can imagine for every project have 20 to 25 project impacts you identified, and for all these impacts we have to give a solution in terms of mitigation measures. So the one thing you have to keep in mind that these mitigation measures, the project proponent is not going to go and invent how to mitigate it. That is not the case. You will be suggesting, recommending to the government what is available. For example, if this is a particular thing, wastewater treatment, if this technology is available, then you say that I am going to use this technology. So in terms of restoration, if there is any restoration techniques available to get rid of these algal blooms, in terms of restoration techniques established, you are going to use that. You are not going to invent a mitigation. That is not the job of the it is out of the scope. So you have to keep that in mind. So now you understand how the mitigation approaches work, from avoidance, reducing, rectifying, and finally the compensation. And compensation is the last resort. It is not preferable. It is the last resort. Okay, so many of the environmentalists, they don't favor compensation because sometimes it can be abused. This is a topic for another day's discussion. I hope you understand the whole process of mitigation. And mitigation, as I said, is the last stage of the environmental impact assessment. Once that is done, you will be submitting the proposal to the government for decision making. I hope you understand things very clearly. Now, what I suggest to you to know different types of mitigation, what you can do is you can look for some real proposal, EIA proposal submitted to the government, take it and go through the whole thing. And the last chapter is mitigation. So you will have different types of impacts. You are already aware of them. Then you go to the mitigation chapter, you say that what kind of mitigation measures these consultants and experts they are suggesting. Okay, so thank you so much, and hopefully we will see about EIA and other kind of discussions in future classes. Thank you so much.